Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case episode 11 of my Star Trek The Original Series episode breakdowns video series. In this video, I'll be looking at Season 3 episodes 56 to 61 of Star Trek The Original Series or Generation to identify historical references which can be used to determine the original history of the Star Trek universe. The episode order I'm using is the production order. In order to understand the development of the history or vision of Star Trek, we need to study the episodes in the order they were written. While I'm uncertain of the exact writing order, the production order is about as close as I can confirm. The episode order information as broadcast is also included. Special thanks to the transcripts which can be found on the Chakotay site. When Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek back in 1966, he had a vision which remained basically consistent over the following 3 years. The animated series and early movies retained the consistency in the most part. When The Next Generation was released in 1987, Gene's vision had changed and the past needed to change in order to be consistent with this new vision. This video series will look at the original vision of Star Trek, starting with the earliest source material. Any historical facts from later sources which contradict the earlier references will be assumed to be an error in this video. Minor changes in nomenclature can be excused. Spectre of the Gun is the 6th episode of the 3rd season. It was the 56th episode produced. Its star date is 4385.3 and its original air date was the 25th of October 1968. In this episode we discover a new planet which tends to be fairly the norm for new episodes. This planet is called Meltonian, or the Meltonian planet. The Federation knew of its existence. While the Federation knew of the Meltonians, they didn't visit very much. The inhabitants of the Meltonian planets are telepaths, which make them difficult to negotiate with. The key takeaways from this episode's not really much. The Enterprise makes contact with a known race of telepaths who, to the best knowledge of the Federation, have never left their planet. Thus, they probably only occupy that single one planet. The Federation wants to make contact with them for some reason not specified. The Meltonians are an independent race in a single system and they don't really trust non-telepaths for some reason. Elaan of Troyius is the 13th episode of the 3rd season. It was the 57th episode produced. Its star date was 4372.5 and its original air date was 20th of December 1968. As with the last episode, in this episode we discover a new star system which has 2 inhabited planets. The outer one is called Troyius. Within this system, called the Telian system, the inner planet is called Elas. Elas apparently has dilithium on it and the Federation wants to get access to that. The Telian system is on the border between the Federation and the Klingon Empire, under Federation control, or within the Federation sphere of influence at least. The problem we have is that the 2 planets in a single system are enemies, but are trying to make an alliance. The key takeaways from this episode is the Telian system, or we discover the Telian system, which is in the border between the Federation and the Klingons, and it has 2 inhabited planets in it. The 2 planets are enemies, and both have just recently achieved atomic weapon technology. I'm uncertain how they fought or even knew much about each other prior to the development of atomic weapons, as developing atomic weapons tend to occur at the same time as spaceflight, but that's the episode for you. The Paradise Syndrome is the 3rd episode of the 3rd season. It was the 58th episode produced. Its star date is 4842.6 and its original air date was the 4th of October 1968. In this episode we discover another planet. It's an Earth-like planet which has a primitive race on it similar to American native Indians. There is an alien object on the planet, so there must be another civilization somewhere else. We discovered that there's someone called, or a race called the Preservers. The Preservers left a deflection system behind, which is the alien object. It must be very old. As a wild guess, if the inhabitants are actually from Earth, then they could have been taken up to 10,000 years ago, probably 10,000 BC. We get additional information about the Preservers. It's an ancient race which call themselves, or at least the people on this planet call them Preservers. They built the deflection system centuries ago. They may have seeded the galaxies with humanoids. The way this worked was when they saw a race under threat, they took them to a safer location. The American Indians in this episode may have been rescued from an Ice Age Earth, thus probably occurred about 10,000 years ago. The key information we get from this episode are as follows. We have an Earth-like planet which is inhabited by a race similar to American Indians. Actually, they are American Indians which have been taken from Earth. We discover the preservers. My guess is the preservers may have been on this planet, the one that Enterprise has discovered 10,000 years ago, to allow all traces of them to disappear. It's unlikely the date is older, as inhabitants must have been able to develop would have been able to develop a high civilization. Look, there's a lot of wild guesses here, but this race could not be from the unknown planet I call Sargon, that is the preservers, as it destroyed itself 500,000 years ago, so it couldn't have rescued the American Indians. It could have been the Metron. Perhaps it's a hidden civilization and may have been the one which sent Gary 7 to Earth, which is probably the most likely candidate. It's likely this is the same race, also possibly, who could have built Baal to look after the primitive people on that particular planet. However, as I lack any other clues, I will assume this could be linked in some vague manner. The way the preservers worked was when they saw a race under threat, they took them to a safer location. The American Indians in this episode may have been rescued from an Ice Age Earth. Thus, that would have occurred around about 10,000 years ago, probably about 10,000 BC. The Enterprise incident is the second episode of the third season. It was the 59th episode produced. Its star date is 5027.3 and its original air date was 27th September 1968. It seems that in this episode we're told the Romulans have a new cloaking device. As they already had a cloaking device which seemed to work rather well in an earlier episode, I'm uncertain why they needed a new one. Thus, I don't think it's a second version of it. I suspect that in fact, this episode is all about the Federation creating an elaborate plan in order to steal the technology of the Romulan cloaking device that we saw in the earlier episode. While this has been confirmed in earlier episodes, we get a second confirmation that the Romulans and Vulcans have the same ancestors. Although in the earlier references, the home of the ancestor was Vulcan and the Romulans were some form of colonizing effort which started in Vulcan and went off somewhere to a new planet to found Romulus, Remus and Remi. In this episode, we discover Spock has been a Starfleet officer for 18 years, which means he became one in 2248. An earlier source indicated this is 2247. This difference could be caused by the confusion around the current year of the episode in question. We discover in this episode, for the first time, Romulan women can be warriors and senior commanders in the Romulan armed forces. The biggest takeaway we get from this episode is Spock became a Starfleet officer in 2248, or about. Another episode states this is 2247. The other key takeaway is Romulan women can be commanders in the Romulan armed forces, making it an equal opportunity workplace, which is very advanced for them. And The Children Shall Lead is the fourth episode of the third season. It was the 60th episode produced. Its star date is 5029.5 and its original air date was the 11th of October 1968. We discover in this episode the Federation has a scientific colony on a planet called Troyius, consisting of only a small number of people. On this alien planet, we discover there is an alien force which controls the minds of the weak, could cause havoc. This force probably destroyed the civilization, or the earlier civilization, of Troyius. We discover there was an ancient race on Troyius, which was destroyed. As nothing remained of the civilization, this must have occurred a long time ago. It would probably take more than 10,000 years to remove all obvious evidences of a civilization, but let's just say it occurred in, let's say, 10,000 BC at the very earliest. We also discover another Federation planet, which is human-inhabited, called Marcos 12. It's human because one of the children has a relative on this planet, and the children are clearly human. This episode also mentions the name of another starbase, in this case, Starbase 4. In summary, in this episode, we discovered Troyius is a Federation scientific colony which used to have a civilization on it. The civilization was destroyed, probably more than 10,000 years ago if it was low-tech civilization, and longer if it was a high-tech civilization. Some evil alien force destroyed the civilization, probably created by an even older civilization, of which we have no information about. Spock's Brain is the first episode of the third season. It was the 61st episode produced. Its star date is 5431.4 and its original air date was 20th September 1968. In this episode, the Enterprise meets an alien spacecraft which is very advanced. This comes from the remnants of an ancient civilization. It uses ion engines and ion power, which apparently is highly advanced compared with the Federation. The Enterprise, in chasing this alien spacecraft, discovers a new system, the Sigma Draconis system, which is most likely not part of the Federation and consists of 3 inhabited planets. The first is at a civilization level of 1485, and the second at 2030, and the third is primitive. In this system, Planet 6 has experienced an ice age and is covered in glaciers. It has primitive inhabitants in the temperate zone at the equator. However, underground is the remnants of an ancient civilization. It has to be more than 10,000 years old, but perhaps not much more than that. We discover that men live on the surface of this planet. The others live underground in the remnants of an advanced civilization's facilities. They are the women with the men on the surface. We discover that there was an advanced civilization on Planet 6 which declined when the planet entered an ice age. Perhaps this occurred more than 10,000 years ago, but let's just pick 10,000 BC at this moment. Key takeaways from this episode is we discover a new system, Sigma Draconis, which has 3 civilizations on it. The system is probably not Federation, is alien, and may be close to the Federation border as the Enterprise has some information on it. One is at 15th century level, the other at 21st century level, and the final is the remnants of a very advanced civilization which declined more than 10,000 years ago. Many of the latter Star Trek movies and shows do not ally with the original vision of the series. This is common in real history, as later historians attempt to change the past in order to justify their belief in the present, or their new beliefs. As I personally enjoyed the original vision of Star Trek, I would hope future movie and TV show material would go back to its original roots, but that's very unlikely. And so this concludes episode 11 of my Star Trek, the original series episode breakdown video series. Alle guten Dingen, kommen zu einem Ende.